Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Nurturing Astrology podcast. I'm Dominique Jaramillo, your astrologer and host. I believe astrology can fast-track personal growth, improve relationships, and empower parents. On this show, I will bring you practical guidance and insight from my own work, studies, and life experiences, as well as interview experts to bring you stellar wisdom from other teachers and professionals to inspire you on your journey. I'm so glad you're here and thanks for tuning in. So sit back, enjoy the show, and be sure to follow, like, and subscribe to catch every new episode as soon as it drops. Your shares and reviews are also much appreciated to help more people benefit from nurturing astrology. Okay, let's dive into today's show. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nurturing Astrology podcast. I'm Dominique Jaramillo, your astrologer and host, and I'm back with another insightful interview with the one and only Rick Levine. Hi, Rick.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
So great to have you here. I'm thrilled. We met this spring at iAstrologer. I've been listening to you for years now. I've been an Inner Circle member with Astrology Hub for 5 years now. And so I've been listening to you there and studying with you and just soaking in all of your wisdom all these years. And I know, like so many, we so appreciate everything you bring. Oh my God. Yeah. So good. It was so great meeting you and bonding over our astrology. Your Cancer moon and my Cancer rising hit it off. So there was instant love. And, I've been listening to you for a while with the Cosmic Connections with Amanda. And I love those shows because I love going into those, those deep conversations, connecting all the dots, like, all the big questions. And my brain always goes to more questions. And I was like, oh my gosh, like how can we, because that's my world, how can I talk about this stuff, or how do we answer these big questions when our little ones are asking, like when the young ones start to really ask those questions, or those big questions about life and death and what's the cosmos and what's beyond. I mean, we're ending Scorpio season right now, right? And heading into Sag. And so I just thought, what are Rick Levine's thoughts on this in terms of, you're a parent and, your daughter's obviously much older, but I don't know if you knew any of this when you were, when your child was young, or if you applied it, or what your thoughts are to, parents utilizing it. So I'd love to explore your thoughts on these topics and sort of in general, can astrology help us with these things? Like, are there places you can look? Is that even possible? But just life's big questions when your kids are asking and like talking about life and death and the cosmos. It just seems like an intriguing contemplation.
Well, it is. And how I would answer this is starting off talking about someone wanting to be an astrologer.
Uh-huh.
And this is like we're taking a step to the side here for a moment, so I can make this point. So if you want to be an astrologer, you're going to be doing counseling work or sitting and talking with people, and those people are going to come in with all kinds of presentations, whether it's, career or love or existential questions or medical, I mean, they're just going to come in with a wide range of stuff for which you, even if you've learned all your astrological tools and techniques, are largely unprepared to answer.
Yes.
And I don't mean that you're unprepared to answer them because you don't expect them to come. You're unprepared, and I'm not saying you, I'm not picking on you in particular. We are unprepared to answer the questions for them because we're unprepared to answer them for ourselves. If those same things happened to us, we wouldn't have a clue.
Exactly.
We would go off looking for someone else.
It's hard enough for us to answer those questions for ourselves.
So in my astrological teaching, or my work with I have an apprentice program. available through Patreon, at patreon.com/Rick Levine. Not that
Nice.
this is meant to be an advertisement.
Of course,
And,
always.
anyhow, part of the work that I do with my apprentices is, in fact, the apprentice group meets 3 times a month. And the first time we meet each month, we are working on our own charts.
Nice.
Because if you don't do the work on yourself, you can't do the work with anyone else.
Mm,
That's that. And so from that standpoint, and if I hear someone who says, "Oh, that's no problem. I've already done the work. I've already done my work." No, that's not the way it works. It's
never ending.
it's well, it's like an onion that the inside, as you peel layers on the outside, there's always more growing from the inside out. And so it's an ongoing process. You were at the OPA, the Organization for Professional Astrology, gathering or conference.
Yeah.
And one of the things about OPA, is its peer group supervision work, because just like a counseling therapist or a medical doctor or
Yeah.
even a kindergarten school teacher, there's always this ongoing program of learning, because we don't have all the answers. Now,
Right.
coming back to your original question, is how do we as a culture answer those questions for our kids? Normally we don't, because we don't have the answers for ourselves.
Right.
And so what we're doing is we're perpetuating generationally derived ignorance. And that's unfortunately how it often works.
Yeah.
And I would like to think um, that we, you and I, although we're of slightly different generations, are generational stoppers, where we're basically saying we're going to do it differently.
Yeah.
Because I sure know that I raised my child very differently than my parents raised me, because my parents had none of these answers, because they were afraid to ask the questions.
Right.
And astrologically, at least historically, questions like the deep meaning of life, and death, and maybe even reincarnation, and
Yeah.
those things, are largely eighth house issues,
Yep.
along with sexuality.
Right.
And therefore we enter into another whole ballywick of things that culturally we don't talk about.
Right.
Even those people who think they're really cool still don't talk about it, or they do in a cavalier and or academic removed way or whatever. I mean, I grew up in a family where there was, I would say, very little, but I think I could probably say no hugging or touching.
Mhm.
And as a kid, I didn't know that anything was missing, or
Yeah.
um, but as an adult and as a parent, I sure rectified that situation. Okay, I do have a Cancer moon, um, but but the fact of the matter is that we come from generations of tradition, where these eighth house matters are in the eighth house, because they're unconscious or subconscious or denied or buried or avoided. They wouldn't be eighth house issues if they were brought out into the open. And in
Right.
fact, one could make a case that some of these issues, in our modern, or let's say early 21st century, in our early 21st century time period, some of these things that used to be eighth house issues are probably more like 11th house issues, because they're that because things like death and sexuality aren't quite as hidden, but that's still through a very, very small percentage of people. I think largely the United States, as a whole, which apparently it never was and never will be. Maybe as we could say, as two halves. I don't know. But the United States prides itself as being so forward and forward thinking, and yet when it comes to issues like sex and death, we are absolutely at the bottom of the barrel as far as cultures that have any sense of dealing with that stuff or talking about it. So how do we pass it on to our kids? Usually we fumble and stumble and avoid and deny and say, here's a book, read it.
Right. And me wanting to do that different, and I'm a communicator. I have a lot in the eighth house, my sun, Mercury, and North Node. So I like going down these rabbit holes and discovering, and I love those questions. And so I encourage them. And I think the key is not to provide answers, but to offer more thought or question, or what do you think? Or just kind of keeping doors
Well,
open.
yeah, I think there are some answers, and yes, there are always questions. And I think we have to also we have to be cautious
Yes.
that in our interest of getting something right that our parents didn't, that we don't start bringing issues and topics to a 4 or 6 or 9 or 11-year-old that
Mhm.
really don't have to be brought up until puberty or post puberty.
Right.
And so I think that there is, in some circles, there is a tendency for the parental fostering of a precociousness that's unnecessary, that prevents, or let me say, inhibits isn't the right word I'm looking for. It basically holds back a child's ability to be a child.
Yes, yes. Well, like early on, if a child, we have losses all the time, whether it's a pet or a family member, when a child is young, and they sometimes start to ask those questions. And oftentimes when they're young, I mean, the veil is thinner, so they seem to be still closer maybe to that other side of those connections, and they ask big questions, or things come out of their mouths that give you those clues that there's still that connection for people like us who are curious about it, or think, oh, and so, are there certain, does that veil close for everyone? Do certain signs, if you will, or energy signatures gravitate to that? I mean, we have empaths, we have, these young kids coming in who really are very much more in tune and psychically connected and things like this. My son and I, he's been talking about angels since he was young, you know, and
Mhm.
his first funeral, his my husband's uncle, he said, oh, I was sitting in church at the funeral, and he said, I felt uncle next to me. He put his hand on my shoulder. He was like, I think 5 or 6. So I'm like, okay, so how do I just sort of support. I don't push or add to, but certainly, um you know angel prayers. He says his angel prayer every night. He's a Pisces, he has a lot of Pisces. So that was the other thing. It's like, is he, is this the Pisces in him? Are all eighth house or water babies kind of intuitively more inclined? And I'm going into this topic in other shows as well, but this all kind of comes together with this eighth house life.
Yeah, whenever you say people and then use the word all in front of it, you're wrong.
Well, yeah, of course
I don't
not.
mean you. I mean,
Yeah,
do all people, think like this? Do all people
no,
approach this? Do all people no, the answer is absolutely
of
not.
course not.
And yes, in a chart, sometimes we have clues, as to who might be more connected with with disincarnate consciousness,
Yeah.
with consciousness forms that do not have a body, whether those consciousness forms
Mhm.
are angels, ghosts, goblins, aliens, spirit guides, or
Yeah.
imaginary friends.
Yeah.
I when my kid was young, we went through a phase where we would actually set a place at the table for her imaginary friend Jessie, who was her playmate. you
That's
know
awesome. Yeah.
it's like, okay,
Yeah.
it's that's not any crazier than worshiping, an invisible god.
Right. Right. Well, I have in my parenting group, they'll be talking about Scorpio, and I have some other friends who are really in tune with Scorpio energy, or their kids have Scorpio energy, and they see or, observe their children being really curious about life and or death and darker things and things like this, and it can scare parents, and it's like, just have to sort of like accept and stay open. And I just wonder, can astrology be a tool for helping parents in these questionable times or moments or around these subjects that are so we can't get right or ambiguous? You know what I mean? Can astrology be an assist or no?
Well, first of all, I don't. First of all, we can get these things right. I don't think it's. I don't think
Hmm.
it's an issue of we can't get it right. I
Okay.
think that may be many people, but I think again it goes back to where I opened, and that is if we're doing our work,
Yeah.
then it's easy to get it right by very simply being present.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
Beginning of question, end of question. All we have to do is be present. There are some things that we don't know, and it's okay to tell your kid, "I don't know, but
I say
this
it a
is what
lot.
I think." This is
Yeah.
what I think. Or very, very, very simply. I know some parents make up elaborate imaginary stories about what happens at death, but then again, so do religions. Um,
Yes.
the idea is also we make up imaginary stories about how you got here. Oh, the stork brought you, or Santa Claus dropped you down the chimney on your head, and you've never been right since, or whatever. But when we start just simply not making a big deal out of this stuff and saying, well, the fact of the matter is that in nature we are part of a great cycle, and that
Mhm.
great cycle is things always change and things come into being and go out of being. And as you grow older, we'll probably have many discussions about this, but the fact of the matter is that people are born and then they die, and when they die, a lot of people have a lot of ideas what happens, and some of them are based upon fears and superstitions, and then there are others that are probably very sensible, that kind of really lead to the awareness that even though we die, we don't really die. We just walk into another room, as Helen Keller said.
Yeah.
We change our awareness because we don't have a body anymore, and it's very possible for things, people, thinking beings to not have a body. It happens all the time. We happen to be privileged. We have a body for a while. We have a body for a few weeks or a few decades or for nearly a century or a century.
Hmm.
And when we do have that body, it's important that we do our best and we treat it well, but there will come a time when we no longer have a body, and yet we can remember people who don't have bodies any longer by speaking of them and keeping their presence alive. And or we can go through life being afraid of something that's natural. Death is just as natural as childbirth. It happens to everyone. There's nothing to fear. The fear that some people get is that some people's parents, not like me, some people's parents are so afraid of dying themselves, they pass that fear on to their kids. And then we get the whole Hollywood scene where movies are made to frighten people to have some sort of emotion, but we don't need to buy in that. We know better. I
That's
mean, that's
yeah.
that's that's just like, and I'm not trying to put any words in anyone's mouth. I would say something like that. You would say something
Yeah.
differently.
It's beautiful. I think that's beautiful what you said, and I totally agree. And I find myself saying those similar things, and I like keeping the curiosity open, but you hit on something interesting, and that is fear. And one of the reasons I have been always on this perpetual student and learning and wanting to know myself in these deeper realms in this way is because of a fear of death, my own, right, and not at wanting to put that onto my own child or anyone else, and me feeling like the more work I do on myself, the less the more the fear, falls away, and there's trust in the beyond, or in the universe, or whatever's holding me or guiding me. But I have to be honest, that is when I would have those thoughts when I was young about not being me anymore, not being here anymore. And it was frightening. And I didn't know what to do with it. So I started learning and exploring
Mhm.
and seeking and trying to
Mhm.
understand myself and why I had those fears. And the last thing I want to do is impart that fear on my child, who seems to be so already open and just, accepting. And it's always, I admire people who say, oh no, I don't fear death. You know, I don't think
Yeah, well,
about it. I'm like, you're so lucky.
most people who say they don't fear death until it's on them that moment, because what turns out is I don't want to die. I know what it is I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to die now. The problem is that now is always
Always.
now.
Yes.
The but there is a couple of things. Number one, is one of the people who a lot of people over the years have looked to for guidance, maybe more my generation, because he was of my generation, and that is the Harvard professor of psychology, Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass.
Yes.
And Ram Dass used to say that the great American death mantra, and a mantra being something that we repeat over and over again, the great American death mantra is, oh shit, because Americans aren't prepared to die. They don't, we avoid is, when I grew up, when you read news, well, we don't even have newspapers that have obituaries anymore, but
Right.
I grew up in a relatively small town, and the local paper, had obituaries. And when you read the paper, you'd scan to see if anyone in town, because everyone knew everyone in town, and the thing is that there were certain things back then, and I'm talking now in the late 50s and even into the 60s, that you didn't say. It was just considered too horrific to say out loud. And one is that no one ever died of cancer. No one ever died of cancer. They died of a long illness.
Mm.
And the inability to say it or print it or talk about it creates more layers of fear over it, because the way astrologically, the way Pluto or Hades, Pluto is just Latin for Hades, which is Greek for hell. The way hell works is that it has more power when it's hidden.
Mm.
So death becomes associated with the hell realms. And one of my Western teachers, guides, an English mystic poet who wrote in the late 1700s, well, born in the mid 1700s, and wrote through the early 1800s, the 19th century. It was William Blake.
Mm.
And William Blake wanted, as his epitaph on his gravestone, he wanted William Blake, born 1757, died many times since.
Don't we? Yeah.
But that in itself is an important teaching lesson for a young child.
Yeah.
And that is that every time someone said, it's like, I want that PlayStation. No, you can't have it. I want cotton candy. No, the sugar's not good for you. We're not getting cotton candy today. Every time someone says no, or every time something happens that in some way stops you from where you want to go, that's death. That's death. Now, the luxury of that kind of death is that after you die, you get to come back into your body after you process it. They take a minute or a second, or sometimes if it's serious and someone you love, passes, dies. Well, you experience that as a death. And it's my contention, and this is another really great thing to talk to kids about, is that when someone dies, it's harder on the people left behind
Yes.
than it is on the person who dies. And here we can go to astrology. Now, there are such things as good deaths and bad deaths, and I'm not judging what the difference is, except I would suggest that there are people who die in a process and it's part of their life. And then there are people who die in horrific states of existence. Whether it's, pain or whether it's an accident of some. I mean, there's just all different types. But when you look at those people who, through some process, maintain a sense of self-awareness through their dying process, whether it's just days, weeks, months, or even with some illnesses, the dying process is years.
Mm-hmm.
But those people who maintain their awareness, best word I can think of, during that process, when they die, over and over and over and over again, as an astrologer, when you look at their charts, they didn't die from a Saturn conjuncting or whatever.
Yeah.
They didn't die from Pluto, Saturn and Pluto. Liz Green once said that Pluto, Saturn's only friend. And she went on to say, with friends like that, you don't need enemies. But people who die in a conscious process almost always die on a Jupiter transit.
Yes.
What's that about? They're going on a long journey.
Yes, the next part of the journey.
We have Saturn and Pluto active when someone dies. Saturn conjuncts the moon, and in a very light treatment of that, you may go through a very difficult time in a relationship, whether you're a kid with living at home with family or married, or you go through a period of time where you just totally not happy in your home environment, in your body, in your life, and you might feel like you might as well die. I'm not saying that you do, and I'm not saying it's even dangerous for death. But in a more dramatic Saturn conjuncting the moon, you may have been in a relationship for 8 years or 45 years, and that relationship ends.
Right.
And that in itself is a form of death.
Yeah.
But also, when Saturn conjuncts one's moon, your mom might die.
Right.
Doesn't make it your fault. But again, it's the hard boundary from Earth's point of view of looking like something ends, and Pluto then creating the transformation that ensues afterwards. Whereas the person who has actually passed, and I'm saying this not from my opinion, but from thousands of hours of reading books and seeing, hearing stories of not only people who have had near-death experiences, but being in the presence of psychic mediums who are actually communicating with disincarnate beings, people who had a body and then dropped it. I've actually tried to avoid, been retraining myself instead of using the words birth and death, because we're not born when we die. We're not born when we come into being. There's some part of us that's already born.
Right.
No, I'm saying that, and again, I'm not stepping into here a discussion about the sensibility of abortions in certain circumstances. Right. And those circumstances may vary greatly depending upon your cultural, religious, and or simply upbringing, or simply your current state of being, physical and or social.
Right.
Now, that aside, there's something that is already conscious an hour before birth, and yet we somehow say that moment of birth is what's important, especially as astrologers. Right. And I'll cycle back to that in a minute, because I believe there is a sensible reason why. But as birth kind of denotes a switch is turned on. It's like the lights turned on, and at death, the lights turned off. And so I've been trying to use the words incarnation
Mm.
and disincarnation, or because we incarnate and we disincarnate. We take a body, we live in a body. It's like becomes like a living meat suit. We live in a body, and then we leave that body behind.
Right.
But I've lectured a number of times at this very magical place. There's been an astrology conference there the last couple of years. I've taught there. I think it was probably for the first time maybe 10 years ago. And it's called Lilydale. And Lilydale is about an hour south of Buffalo in New York State, in the country. It's very, very rural. And Lilydale was incorporated in the, I think maybe 1860s, 1870s. And it's the home of the American Spiritualist Church.
Ah.
And the American Spiritualist Church is basically a non-Christian denomination church. Um, Jesus doesn't play into the church, but the immortality of the soul does.
Okay.
So, and a spiritualist church service, like a Sunday morning go to church service, consists of certified psychic mediums going around the room and doing what they call messenger service.
Oh,
And
wow.
what is messenger service is giving people messages from the other side. And they
Wow.
may not get something for everybody always, but I've been to these, things, and it's like, my story is I was probably about 26. Yeah, I was probably about 26 or 27 years old. And I got dragged to one of these by a friend, a girlfriend, actually later to become wife, first wife, second wife, third wife, fourth wife. I don't know. I can't keep them straight. No, I'm kidding. And the only person I knew in the room was her, and I didn't know her all that well at that point in time. We were just, getting to know each other. And in a room full of probably about 40 people that I knew none of, someone at the front of the room who I never met before and never talked with and never have since, as far as I know, went around the room and got to me and said, there's an older woman here for you. She's identifying herself as your grandmother, and she just wants you to know that it was okay that you didn't go to her funeral, that she understands, and that when you lived with her before you moved out west, that added those months onto her life because she was ready to go before that. And the story was that I'd lived with my grandmother for about 3 or 4 months because she lived in New York City and I needed a job, and I went to New York and worked, and she had an extra room, and she was not well. And then when I moved out west, my first move out west, at that time it seemed like it was west, but it was Minneapolis. Um, she died not long after. But this is one of hundreds, thousands, and thousands of stories like this. And what's that mechanism about? Um, PBS, public TV, did a documentary on Lilydale, I think probably about 15 years ago. And the title of the documentary was Nobody Dies at Lilydale.
Okay.
So there is an entire world of not only evidence, sound evidence, and stories, but anyone who has ever done a past life regression, which is something that I'm actually doing a lecture on next week for my patrons, $10 a month and higher, doing a lecture on this. But it's the lecture actually I did at Lilydale a couple of months ago. And the title of the lecture was something like A Radical Look at Reincarnation.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
think I heard about that.
and the subtitle was Consciousness Con Carne.
Love it.
Because that's what we are.
Yes.
We're consciousness con carne.
Oh
And
yeah.
when we're done with this body, we're consciousness incarnate. We're without meat.
Oh yeah.
Carne just meat. But in fact, that's the origin of the word incarnation, is coming into meat. That's what the word carne, I mean,
Carne
uh
asada.
carne asada. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
I
or
I do.
or a taco con carne.
Right, right. Oh yeah, I agree with all that. I was on the quest early on reading like conversations with God when I was young, going to church with different friends, trying to figure out what was what and realize there's all these choices. How can you be persecuted for choosing one? Like how are you supposed to know? And so I started exploring all realms and then I went to John Edwards a few times and that was fascinating to watch and I just love I've been to
I
them
know, I know,
myself.
I know, I know, I know John well.
You always so great.
He's
So
is
great.
he not only is he a good guy,
Hmm.
and he means well, and he lives that life. I mean, he's raised his kids well. He's conscious, and he's also a good astrologer. Just for
Yeah.
the record,
Yeah. Says he doesn't really know much sometimes. I'm like,
he
I don't
said,
think so.
yeah, yeah. I've worked with him in that realm a bit. And But that's right, being in John's presence where he's
Mm,
doing his work. I mean, there's no way that one could make up what happens when John is, and it's not just John. I've seen many other
yeah.
people who are capable, and in fact, it
Same.
is my contention that aside from every year at Halloween when the veil is thinned, my contention is that culturally, we are vibrating at ever higher frequencies, and that the veil between here and there is thinner and thinner and thinner, and that
Mm,
and I'm not going to go biblical on you, but the concept of revelation is actually kind of already occurring now. Forget all the other horns and trumpets and whatever, because everyone who's ever lived is kind of living in a way that 100 years ago no one could have imagined.
yeah.
That you could have like just thought Joan of Arc and then spend 5 hours watching Joan of Arc in action. Okay, it's not her, but it's someone stepping into that awareness, and consciousness,
Mhm.
and that the idea of we talk about past life regression. That's not an old. I mean, past lives are an old thing, you know. But hypnotic past life regression, actually, the first person who was ever regressed hypnotically and recorded was in 1953 in Colorado Springs.
Oh,
That's the first documented case of a past life regression done, through a guided, a
mhm.
guided voice. Now, granted, the temples, the Greek temple, I mean, they all had their own ways of working with reincarnation and a process. Certainly, the Egyptians also, but it wasn't like a close your eyes, you're walking down the steps.
Right, right.
There's three doors, open a door. I mean, I'm not making fun of this at all. I'm just
Yeah.
saying it's a very recent thing. It really wasn't until the 70s that past life regression became a thing.
When did Many Lives, Many Masters come out? I know that was a big, that's what I read and like was really open the door to that for me.
Yeah, and he also is an ex. I worked with him one day. A doc. Help me with his
Cake?
name, huh?
Uh, I'm thinking of Case, but that's what some of the,
No, no, no,
no,
not.
Weiss. Weiss.
Yeah, thank you. Um, he He did a conference in Seattle a number of years ago, and I was just involved with some of the other parts of it. And I was his stage manager, in effect, for a day, and worked with him. He does an astrological chart on everyone he regresses. Doesn't tell them,
Interesting.
but it's part of what he does. And yeah, astrologically, I think sometimes, I mean, we have a whole branch of astrology now called evolutionary astrology,
Right.
which comes out of the work of Jeff Green back in the 1960s. And then a number of other teachers have taken it, to next levels. And there are many, many excellent evolutionary astrologers
Mhm.
and evolutionary astrology teachers,
Features, yeah.
including my older, smarter brother, Stephen Forrest. We're born
Ah,
3 months apart. And so,
wow. Oh, yeah.
but the I have issues with the idea of past life regressions being linear,
Mm,
because outside of a body with flesh, pretty much all the traditions agree that there is no linearity to time.
right.
Everything Buddhists teach that everything that's ever happened and everything that ever will happen is happening now.
No, right.
And it doesn't change the use or the value, but it kind of shows us that even when we think we know what's going on, we're looking at it through an anthropomorphic human individual. This thing keeps shaking. Okay. um through kind of a human perception.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And we have to kind of frame it in some way that we can understand it.
Absolutely. Wow, a lot to think about. Yeah, I could go down the rabbit hole of I love astrology that can be seen in the Bible. You know, it's all connected. I know that all these different realms are all connected, and you can see them in the astrology too. I still think it's a great tool, but yeah, it's it leaves me always like thinking of more.
Right, but if we say that you can see astrology in the Bible,
Mhm.
it's really important to also say that you can see astrology in the Upanishads, in the Vedas, in the
Absolutely. Yeah,
Quran, in
that's what I mean.
almost any document that is
Mhm.
allegedly divinely inspired.
Yes.
There is an order, a logic, to the cosmos. There
Yes.
is a logos to the astro.
So if I understand this correctly too, you were saying that you think that just because of time and evolution, that the veil is getting thinner and thinner just on a naturally, right? Because we all are more and more seeking outside the realm
I
of talking to.
I think that um ultimately the universe is a vibration between physical and metaphysical.
Right.
And it's fractal on every scale. And I believe that the Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote a book back in the 1920s called The Phenomenon of Man, and many other books. The and actually he had to leave the church to publish the book, although he kept his title because they didn't want that book published. He came up with the idea of what he labeled the noosphere. And you can think of the nous as a part of the same root word as gnostic, or agnostic, without knowing. But gnosis, which we often see with a G on it, gnosis is like a knowing.
Right.
And the noosphere was in Teilhard's work. There's this concept that the fire of the intellect, and he actually referred to it as the fire of the truth of Christ. And I don't think I think that's a I don't want to say it's limited, but that's a vocabulary that is apparent from where he comes from, but it's not that. It's more or wider than that. In fact, many people say that Teilhard's philosophy of the noosphere coming into being is what we now call the World Wide Web, or the buzz of intellect and and passion that gives us an exo nervous system. Our nervous system is not now out there. But point being that there was a time a couple of thousand years ago, even though there was an astrology, astrology was only done for kings and queens
Right.
and dukes um, and most people had no idea of anything about astrology. Why? Because survival was so pressing always. Back to Ram Dass. Ram Dass used to say that until you get the 500-pound boulder off your foot,
Yeah.
you're not going to be meditating or thinking about God. Or another way of saying that is God comes to the homeless in the form of food and shelter.
Yeah.
So when we're so concerned as we were, and many people, I get, I mean, we're speaking from privileged perspectives, you and I, many people are still there, but largely, I mean, people didn't have food. They had to spend their entire life trying to survive the next day or the next winter.
Right.
And so that's having to deal with the material things.
Yeah.
Now, certainly, I would not argue, certainly there's always been a spiritual tradition woven into these. And there are those people, even from the far north, Arctic people, there were shamans and there were magical, mystical people in every tradition. I mean, the Catholic Church, which is built upon the concept that there is no nothingness, that there's a three-dimensional world, and that nothingness is reserved for God, that realm. However, even within Catholicism, there is a mystical tradition.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that there's no mystical tradition. What I'm saying is that as we move further and further into the electronic and digital realms, we've all become mystics without even knowing it. That metaphysics is taking over physics. That we now kind of know where we what we know is that the creation of the human being, or the creation of what we call life, or any company or any project, begins as a thought and then is manifest. And it's not like we manifest to some complexity and then develop a thought, which is the way, science, which is not very good at getting some important basic things right. I love the Deepak Chopra line that modern science suffers from its insistent belief in the ancient superstition of materialism. It's a great line. It's one of those lines I wish I came up with, but no, it's still a good line. But the point is that when you look at now how we spend time on the internet, where are we physically? Where are you and I physically right now?
Yeah.
We're in some the Tibetans would call this a bardo, an intermediate state of existence that's not physical, because we're in some meta physical realm where we are having this conversation. And so we now live in a world where people spend more time in metaphysical realms and than they do even in fantasy. So yeah, I believe that ultimately we will vibrate ourselves, right out of the material realm, which is kind of what at least partly I believe is what the alien phenomenon, is. Not that they're, how do I say this not negatively? I mean, I do believe that there is consciousness throughout the universe, not just on planet Earth and not just in humans.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And to bring that like to full circle, the little ones coming in right now are already vibrating at that, right? Like
Yeah.
they're, we see that in the astrology. So that's what makes me like they're way ahead of the game. It's like we're worried about how are we going to maybe talk about these things, but I feel like they're already beyond us in so many
Hey,
ways.
I was nearly 40 before I was allowed to touch the internet because it didn't exist.
Exactly,
you know?
right? Yeah,
And now people, people come into life now, and I mean, how many people don't even know what it was like to live without a cell phone?
I know. Absolutely. The kids these days, I mean, now it's all AI and virtual reality. My son's, in virtual reality, and it's like that we're going to be the ones going, how do you make this thing work? When we were teaching, I'm helping my mom with her email and getting on Facebook and things like this. And now you're like, oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
I've excluded myself from that. I keep up with all of it, I think, pretty much. But
Yeah.
the point is well taken, and that and the whole, artificial reality, or actually even more important, I think, is what we call augmented reality,
Mm-hmm.
where we could be wearing glasses that every time we look at someone, it comes up with their name, or
Yeah.
or we look at a product and it has where it was made in the history and I mean, there's way, but all of this will become more and more part of normal life,
Yeah.
whatever normal is. And
Yeah.
we might think that that's like crazy and that's a whole different universe. But when you compare how we live our life to how people did just 100 years ago, it was that much different than it is now, than to now.
Absolutely. Wow.
So coming back, I'll play the job as host or hostess.
Yeah.
Coming full
Circle.
circle. So how do we lead our kids? It's almost God was I'm not normally this biblical, but it's like Moses leading the kids into promised land. We don't get to go to what's
Right.
next. We don't
Yeah.
have all the answers. All we can do is show up with what we know and guide them along that path.
Yeah.
And the way we even get to do that is by being present, is
Yes.
by doing our own work or doing our work on ourselves. And there's a wonderful um, uh, song. Do you know who Robert Hunter was?
I don't think so.
And have you ever heard of this band called the Grateful Dead?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
All right. So Robert Hunter wrote the lyrics to probably about 90% of all the songs that they ever performed over their 45 years or however long they were around.
Wow.
I mean, you can take whatever if you're a Dead fan, and know songs like either like Truckin' or Friend of the Devil or China. It doesn't matter. Robert Hunter wrote them all. He wrote the lyrics.
Wow. Okay.
Now, the reason why I'm bringing up Robert Hunter is that Robert Hunter his lyrics often were incredibly magical, that could touch that place between physical and non-physical.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the songs that a lot of people do know from the Grateful Dead, but don't give it any thought because it's such a light and almost happy, it's like an anthem, called Ripple. I don't know if you know that song, Ripple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And but it's basically ripple in still water where there is no pebble tossed,
Ah.
you know,
Oh.
and it's reach out your hand if your cup be empty. If your cup is full, may it be again. Let it be known there is a fountain that was not made by the hands of men. Now, this is where we're going with this, though. There is a road, no simple highway, between the dawn and the dark of night. And if you go, no one may follow. That path is for your steps alone. And then it goes on to say, you who choose to lead must follow. But if you fall alone. If you should stand, then who's to guide you? If I knew the way, I would take you home. The point is that we are all like that person that's being written about in that we're all walking a path.
Yeah.
We're all following others.
Right.
Others are following us.
Us.
Uh, if we fall, we're done. But if we stand, then we're going to continue to have followers, and we don't know where we're going. We're just doing the best we can. In effect, each and every one of us.
Yes.
So when it comes to how do you deal with your kids, that song, teach them that song early on. Sing it for your evening prayer before dinner. I don't know.
I love that.
It's but I think that the worst thing that we can do as parents is pass along our ignorance and or pass along our fear. And
Mhm.
the real thing, though, is that we can't just intellectually decide to do that. In order
Right.
to not pass along in order to not pass along ignorance or fear, we have to do our work. We have to do the
Yes.
work on ourselves so that we can stand at the edge at this road between the dark and the dawn, this nighttime place, these hell realms
Yeah.
that William Blake wrote. Hell was a place so beautiful it would torment an angel to insanity, because that's where the magic occurs. So
Yeah.
how do we teach, our kids that it's okay to be here, it's okay to not know, it's okay to lose control, it's okay to go in that place into those twilight realms, but to come back. I think of Rumi, when you go to the garden,
Mhm.
don't spend all your time with the thorns and the roses. you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
it's so, but
Oh,
those
that's
are things as
beautiful.
parents that we can in fact instill in our kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And certainly, even working with parenting being one of my strong focuses, it's really about, it starts with the parent all the time. I always come back to the parent. It isn't always about looking at the child's chart. And even though they want to look at the child's chart, it always has to be looking in relationship from you and bringing it back to you, but in your opinion, you know, what is your opinion about looking at child's charts? I know.
Oh, I think it's very interesting. I think looking at a child's chart is very good. I think of the comedian Bob Hope on his deathbed. His wife said, Bob, I know you're very close to the edge right now. They'd been talking about it. She said, but I just realized we've never talked about where you want to be buried. What should I do? Where do you want to be buried? And he said, surprise me.
Yeah.
In a way, it's that kind of attitude,
Mhm.
that in dealing with our kids, there are things that we can rely on people, like psychic mediums, like the Tibetan Buddhists who have spent a lot of time mapping those bardo states between death and rebirth. I mean, these are not unknown things. If we want to explore them, we can, but ultimately we don't know.
Right. Yeah,
And
that's
that's okay, because part of being a human is we don't know.
absolutely. As an Aquarius, the one who wants to know, that's the thing I've grown into the most is just not knowing. I'm a perpetual student. I don't have any answers. I want to have
But
them, but I don't.
one of the dangerous things I think about looking at a kid's chart
Mm.
is steering them in a certain direction
Yes.
because of this or that. And this is why I came up with that Bob Hope story. It's when we have a kid and we watch that kid grow, the
Hmm.
best thing that we could say to them, is surprise me.
Yes. And it's all about
Because
potential.
it's like, for making a kid, study music because they have a strong Pisces chart,
Right.
making a kid study this or do that or be outside, or I
Right.
mean, obviously there are things that we can guide,
For
but
sure.
when we're guiding our children, when we're having these conversations about things that are on the edge, um, the child can be the guide, or
Absolutely.
the child can be, if not the guide, can be the weather vane that's letting us know which way the wind blows, rather than us top down, acting with authority, saying this is the way it is.
Yeah.
I have an amazing daughter, and I've had many people over the years go, God, you must have been an amazing parent. And my answer is no, I just knew when to get out of the way.
Yeah. It's a process, right, of letting go too, for sure. And I think that there's a lot of value to looking at the chart early on in terms of just how to understand the difference in our nature. So you really know when you're getting in the way and you're not really helping, you know,
Well, and that is less looking at their chart than
more
looking
looking at
at the
yours.
sit. Well, looking at the synastry. In
Yes.
other words, if you
Right.
if you have a kid who's Venus is square your Saturn, you're going to have to understand the effect and the impact
Right.
of what you say is real onto that onto that kid's sense of value and what their needs and desires are.
Right.
And so by using astrology to understand some of those things, we can avoid pitfalls. But that's less about looking at their chart and saying, that Venus in
Yes.
Gemini means that they're going to be reading a lot, or whatever.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, those are all potentials or things to be aware of so that I feel like those can provide the parent an opportunity of something to to watch, to witness, look for.
Yeah,
If your child
yeah.
is out a lot of Gemini, they're going to talk a lot maybe or be curious, so pay attention. What are they curious about? What are they interested in? Where those kinds of things, it's about presenting an opportunity to observe with some interesting insight as
Right,
possibilities.
right. But what I'm also saying is, so if you have a kid with the sun in Gemini and Mercury in Gemini, um, and the kid isn't very curious, don't force them into being,
Right. Exactly.
because again, these are our assumptions about signs. And when one does a lot of charts over the years,
Mhm.
one becomes aware that everyone who brings in a chart doesn't conform to that chart the way you thought they might.
Okay.
Everyone's got their surprises, and it's those surprises that are often the most magical things. And we
Yeah.
don't want to cut that off in a kid's chart.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally agree. Keeping those open. That's why I always say you can look at a chart and see all these potentials, but you're living it. It comes alive in conversation with people. Their charts come alive and you see, oh, this is interesting how this is evolved. And I
Yep.
think looking at a baby's chart, it's like, you know, I always say, just, maybe you look at their moon and stay right there for like 7 years. Like you don't need to be looking too deeply. And it does come back to us really knowing ourselves and how to be our parenting style and how to be a good parent in terms of knowing ourselves and where that synastry is key. So,
Well, that's right. And what that synastry shows is that being a good parent to child number one is a very different thing than being a good parent to child number two.
exactly.
And it also shows that the relationship that we have with child number one is not the same relationship that child number one has with us.
Yes. And I think another big one is that child's relationship with mom is very different than child's relationship with dad or
Yeah.
partner, right? And so understanding those differences and staying out of the way of that
Yep.
relationship dynamic,
Yep. All right. We've solved
So,
this one.
yes. And oh my gosh, we could probably talk forever. I so appreciate you going down this rabbit hole with me. It's so interesting. I could talk for you for hours. I like to listen to you for hours. And I really appreciate you coming on and let's stay in touch.
And I would be missing my responsibility of being on your show if I didn't let people know
Oh, please.
that they can find me on Facebook
Mm-hmm.
at Rick Levine Astrologer,
Yep.
on Instagram Rick Levine Astrologer, or on Patreon, where I offer a variety
Yeah.
of online group Zoom meetings, teachings, and videos. And that's patreon.com/Rick Levine.
Do you have any big events coming up or things you're doing?
Well, I haven't traveled internationally since pre-COVID, and I was in Indonesia when everything was locking down, and I kind
Oh,
of
wow.
ran home. I was there for like about 4 months,
Oh,
and
wow.
so yeah, this is my first year. I'll be speaking at the London AA conference this summer.
Nice.
I'll be speaking at the Belgrade conference, Belgrade, Serbia, in May,
Wow.
and we're putting together right now, for about a year from now. I'll be back in India and doing a 10-day immersive called Initiation into Astrology, and this is for beginners, advanced, professionals, the whole group. It's
How exciting.
yeah, and that's 10 days, and that'll be in Goa, India. And Goa is a pretty magical part of India. And of course, the one thing I didn't say that I should have before, is that I do a free, and it will always be free, monthly astrology forecast for the month ahead. This still being November, my November's is up. You can find me
Awesome.
on YouTube at Rick Levine, youtube.com/Rick Levine. And I will announce as the dates for the Goa thing becomes more solid. I'll announce that there.
Awesome.
And that's going to be fun. It's like
Yeah.
this
Wow.
place, the place where we do this at. It's an Ayurvedic healing center, and it's right just like a stone's throw to the beach in Goa. Goa actually it's south, maybe a couple hundred miles south of Mumbai, but
Mm.
that's it's a little province or state in India that was not part of India until 1965. It was Portuguese. It was a Portuguese trading center, and so it's a little bit different than the rest of India because it's a little bit wealthier, and it's a little bit more. Well, the Portuguese aspect, there's a fair, a fair amount of Catholic people living there because the Portuguese, inhabited it, and it doesn't have any of the British Raj, a couple hundred years of the British rule. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. That'll be around Christmas next year. It'll probably be
Awesome.
right around the holidays.
Awesome. And are you coming back to do some more cosmic connections with Amanda? I haven't seen any of
Yeah, I'm doing one. Well, let's see. If I say tomorrow, it won't mean anything to anyone watching this.
it's
But yes, I'm doing them
Thursday.
every other week,
Every
and Thursday afternoons. The time varies. Sometimes
yeah.
they always go up on YouTube. And the other exciting piece is that Amanda and I are turning the 15 or 20 best of the cosmic connections into a book.
Awesome.
So for those people who like to read, they will have all of those in book form
Oh,
soon enough.
wow. And you're
We're
working on your
working on
own
it.
book, aren't you? About some aspects?
Quantum astrology.
Yes.
It's yeah, and quantum astrology. Actually, the subtitle is "The Physics of Metaphysics,"
Mm,
and it's a book that'll
juicy.
be theory and practice, because it definitely, once you begin to understand the quantum nature of the macrocosm, not just the subatomic realm, the microcosm, it shifts a little bit of the way we practice astrology, which we can see from how people are practicing astrology now compared to 50 or 100 years ago. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so this book is a look at that, is a look at that shift.
Fascinating. Oh, can't wait. Sounds like a goodie. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Levine. I appreciate you being here with me. It's been a great conversation. And yeah, love to have you back sometime, but I so appreciate it. Keep doing what you're doing. It's awesome.
My pleasure, and right back at you.
Thanks. Thanks for listening, and I hope you gained some great astrology insight and inspiration from today's show. I'd love to hear, so drop me a comment or share in a review. Check out the show notes for all the details and links about today's episode, how you can connect with me on social or work with me directly. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. Oh, and for my moms out there, be sure to join my private Conscious Parenting with Astrology Moms group on Facebook. Come join a growing community of like-minded mamas supporting each other in the hardest job in the world with the help of astrology. Hope to see you over there. Take care and keep nurturing the nature, friends. I'll see you on the next episode.